There's some movies that try very hard to convince you that they're real. And then there's some movies like the one that we'll be taking a look at today that don't really try at all. It doesn't start with any warnings. It doesn't tell you how you're supposed to feel. It just starts talking to people. And for this film, we mean that literally. How's it going, y'all? Today, I wanted to take a look at a film that I came across recently. It's a film that I feel like isn't really getting as much traction as it probably should, even though it's from the early 2000s. And the film that we're going to be taking a look at today is The Wicksboro Incident by the Lowry brothers. But before we go any further, I am going to be walking through this film in its entirety. So if you haven't taken the chance to go and look at it, I highly recommend that you do. The link will be down in the description for you to go watch. However, if you want to go in blind and just listen to a pale ginger kid talk to you about it, then by all means, stick around. The first 20 minutes of the film is chopped up into a couple different interviews that really set the backstory for the rest of the film. People sitting in quiet rooms speaking about things that should sound unbelievable, but somehow they don't. The longest and most important interview that we have is going to be with a man named Lloyd, who will eventually be our main character later on down the road. Lloyd is a soft-spoken gentleman. He's a bit older. He doesn't look like he's someone that's trying to sell you a story. He explains that he hasn't used his real name in decades, and not because he's hiding from the law, but because he feels like someone has been looking for him since the day Wicksboro disappeared. According to Lloyd, he is the only person that survived the Wicksboro disappearance incident, and the way he says it isn't dramatic. It's exhausted, like he's been waiting 40 years for someone to finally hear his story and listen to him. Before the Wicksboro incident, Lloyd had a pretty prolific scientific career. He explains that during the Korean War, he worked in radar research, and more specifically, he worked on microwaves within that radar research. But eventually, his work drifted into something far stranger. He and his team began experimenting on something that they called alpha transmissions, or what we'll come to learn is brainwaves. At first, the results were pretty boring. Every person kind of produced the same signal. But then they started hearing something else. New sounds, new patterns, just something that didn't resemble any human brain activity. Lloyd says he believes that these sounds were coming from telepathic individuals, people whose brains operated differently. At this point of the film, it shifts in a slight way because Lloyd doesn't deliberately go out and say that it's aliens at first. He doesn't panic, he doesn't speculate widely, he just explains what he found and hopes that you'll listen. Eventually, the government took interest in his project, not quite curiosity, but more control. Lloyd explains that one day that their lab was broken into, documents stolen, items vandalized, and most importantly, their prototype for the alpha receiver, which received the alpha transmissions, was stolen. Soon after, Lloyd was transferred to another base. Some were quiet, some were remote, some were just off the grid. This place would later become known as Wicksboro, Texas. When Lloyd arrived, he discovered that the government had converted an old fallout shelter into what became their lab and workshop to continue working on the alpha receiver and alpha transmissions. And this is where Lloyd's life, according to him, briefly became normal. He met a woman named Anna and fell in love. He kind of started to have a normal life in Wicksboro, Texas. And the film kind of sits here and rests long enough to let you feel a sense of normalcy. However, it doesn't last very long. In fact, Lloyd gives an exact date and an exact time at when all of this normalcy ended. October 4th, 1953 at 7:30 in the morning. He had been working all night on the alpha receiver and alpha transmission prototype and ended up falling asleep in his laboratory. And then something strange happened. He describes a sudden sensation just ripping through his body, almost like he's being electrocuted. He says that it felt like his head was going to burst, and his wristwatch became so hot that he had to rip it off and throw it across the room. During this part of Lloyd's interview, he ends up showing us the spot on his wrist, which his watch ended up burning. The entire event only lasted about 20 seconds, but to Lloyd, it felt endless. When Lloyd regained his senses, he decided to go back up into the house where him and the other researchers were staying to see if they were all alright. However, when he got there were no researchers to be found. At first, he wasn't alarmed because him and his researchers had a routine of going to the local diner and cafe to grab breakfast and coffee in the morning. So, instinctively, Lloyd ran down to the cafe to go find his associates. However, on Lloyd's way to the cafe, he says he notices an eerie silence, like an unnatural silence. He says there were no birds chirping, there were no dogs barking, and just no people about. It just didn't feel natural. However, when he entered the cafe, it was completely empty, apart from mugs resting on the counter, still steaming as if they had just been poured with coffee, and breakfasts left half-eaten. People hadn't left hours ago. They had left mid-morning. Lloyd ran to Anna's house and feared that something had happened to her. But when he got there and ran up the stairs, she was vanished. No weapons, no signs of violence, no signs of struggle, just simply gone. It's at this point in Lloyd's life that he realizes that something has gone very wrong. Once Lloyd figures out what's happening, he doesn't really stay to investigate because, why would you when everybody else in your town just vanished? From there, he ends up buying a train ticket to Los Angeles, where he feels that he's going to be safer under the concealment of a larger city. And from that day on, Lloyd went into hiding because to him, the government hadn't have just erased the town, it erased everyone connected to it. Lloyd explains that after the disappearance of Wicksboro, people that were somehow in some way connected to Wicksboro just started disappearing. This includes Lloyd's sister, a healthy woman in her 20s who ends up dying mysteriously from some random illness. Lloyd then pulls out a box from one of his upper cabinets that's filled with obituaries. These are scientists, townspeople, doctors, nurses, just regular everyday people. However, he claims that all of these people were connected to the town Wicksboro. As Lloyd lays all of these clippings out, the film kind of asks its first question. Is Lloyd someone that's been traumatized with paranoia? Or did he actually see something that he wasn't supposed to see? Up to this point, the film hasn't really asked us to believe Lloyd's story. It just kind of lets us sit with it, lets it register. And then the film starts doing something important. It doesn't just rely on a single voice. After Lloyd's interview, we cut to some grainy footage. The footage shows UFOs that are flying around what is supposedly Wicksboro. Even in one of these clips, it shows a UFO crashing into the desert and just exploding into a whole bunch of pixels. But anyway. We're then introduced to a shadowy black figure, a person that is supposedly a former NASA employee. He explains that over the last 20 years, tensions between us and them have been rising. And I think when you can tell if he says them, that means alien. He then goes to explain that these aliens see us human beings as destructive, primitive, and incapable of protecting our planet. And more importantly, they want it. He says that both the government and these beings will do whatever it takes to keep their existence a secret. Next, we meet a younger woman whose face is completely blurred and pixelated. She explains that her She explains that her father was a colonel in the United States Air Force, and for 30 years he carried around a secret that wasn't supposed to be shared. However, she continues to explain that her father couldn't just hold it in anymore, and he had to explain and he had to come clean with the information that he knew. And not long after, her father passed away. Now, the woman that's being interviewed, the daughter of the US Air Force colonel, does not hesitate to say that he was murdered. She ends her interview stating the last thing that her father ever told her before he passed away. He explains that if you ever wondered whether we are alone in this infinite universe, wonder no more. But just as this film and story start to get overwhelmed with alien conspiracy and government cover-up, we're introduced to our counterweight, Robert Patton. Robert Patton works for the Bureau of Extraterrestrial Investigations. If Lloyd represents belief and the NASA employee represents fear, then Robert Patton definitely represents refusal. He's calm, professional, and he's dismissive. He explains that society needs myths and legends, Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, aliens. He thinks people want something larger than themselves to believe in. Robert says that he and his bureau have investigated countless cases, and he emphasizes that not one of them has been found to be legitimate. At the beginning, Patton works as a good grounding character to all the alien and conspiracy jargon that we've heard so far in the film. The former NASA employee comes back into play and continues his interview. In this part of his interview, he talks about space shuttle live streams that occurred back in the 90s. Anyone with cable TV could have watched these live broadcasts back in the 90s. However, during some of these live broadcasts, objects were seen accelerating and moving across the screen. Some more grainy UFO footage is played of these accelerating objects, and he says that people started to raise questions about these objects. He then goes to explain that once people started noticing these objects, NASA cut all of the live broadcasts. Once he started examining the footage, he knew and realized that this wasn't just space debris or ice particles. He realized that some of these objects were massive, some of them the size of football fields, and that's American football fields. I'm sorry. He even claims to have seen one of these alien crafts being fired upon by human aircraft, which is just bizarre to me to think about your local F-16 just flying overhead and pop an alien spacecraft, but I digress. The film immediately then cuts back to Robert Patton. We watch the same footage that the NASA employee just explained were alien-sized football fields, and he just chalks it up to ice particles and debris. We then cut back to the NASA employee, and it explains just that he was told to tell the public that it was all just ice particles and space debris. This implies that the BEI is likely behind all the cover-ups. At this point, the movie pivots again. We're back with Lloyd, but in this case, we're not in an interview room, we're actually out in the public. Lloyd's out in public with the interview directors, Gary and Mike, who we'll end up knowing a little bit more about later. The three are standing in a populated area, maybe a cafe or a business district. Lloyd then pulls out his alpha receiver, which resembles somewhat of a Power Rangers toy, but he says that he spent 5 years building the machine and starts pointing it at random passersby and starts telling the guys that either they're aliens or they're humans. Mike and Gary start to ask Lloyd some questions about the device and whether he's ever gotten any funny looks or had any problems with security. And Lloyd pretty much just chalks it up to everybody looks at him like he's crazy, which who wouldn't? I mean, look at it. We then move into a scene of the guys still in the same business district, except they're tallying up aliens and humans that Lloyd is counting on his receiver. Quickly, the alien side begins to fill up and almost matches, if not surpasses, the human side. Because of this, Lloyd insists that the alien population is increasing around us. At the end of this section, the film has done something very deliberate. It hasn't proven anything. Instead, it created a world split right down the middle. Lloyd, haunted and convinced, whistleblowers, afraid and anonymous, and a government agency that really doesn't want you to believe the aliens are real. Sound familiar? Didn't think so either. But somewhere in between them, you have you, the viewer. The question is no longer, is Wicksboro real? The question becomes, if it is, why are so many people afraid? And that's where the film begins its next transition. The interviews stop here, and we go into more found footage aspect of everything, where we follow Lloyd, Gary, and Mike to go find the town of Wicksboro. We cut to Mike and Gary in their apartment. They look around the northwest border of Texas, where Lloyd says that the town should be, but they find nothing. Not a town, not a landmark, not even a typo. They then decide to take a good old-fashioned trip to the library to see if they can find anything there. Mike and Gary walk into their local library and approach the librarian at the desk. They ask if he has any records, maps, documents, just anything that's referencing the town Wicksboro. The librarian then goes to check all the databases, and he goes and pulls atlases and just all different kinds of books that he can possibly find that may contain something including Wicksboro. After some searching, he comes up short and eventually goes behind his desk and pulls out a key from the drawer. He then takes this key all the way to a back room that's just filled with more books to see if he can find anything further. Finally, he returns empty-handed and says the good old line,
"There's a good chance your man is a bullshit artist."
Up until now, the film has kind of floated between belief and disbelief in Wicksboro, but now is the first time that someone's really saying that Wicksboro may not exist. They then start their road trip. We then cut to Mike, Gary, and Lloyd in the early mornings of November 1st. From here, it's pretty casual. It's just some short clips of the guys stopping at gas stations, calling their families, and just kind of having a grand old time. There's a scene in the movie where the camera pans back to Lloyd and he's asleep with a lit cigarette in the back of his hand, so Mike and Gary take it away from him and claim that he shouldn't be allowed to drive, which totally agree. They kind of stare at him like they're exhausted parents. It's just funny. And it's moments like this that really help the movie feel authentic and real, because the characters aren't just exposition machines, they're people experiencing something bizarre. The film then shifts to a quick but somber scene where Lloyd and the team goes and visits his late sister's grave. From here, Lloyd is explaining how he feels remorse and he just feels overall guilty. He explains that he feels that she would still be alive if he had never gotten involved with Wicksboro. Something that just kind of shows what they're really getting into. When the crew is about 30 miles from the Texas border, they stop yet again and take a little rest. Mike calls his wife, and then Gary and Mike have a conversation. Gary asks Mike, "Do you really think that the town is going to be there?" And Mike just kind of shrugs it off. He's still pretty skeptical at this point. The crew then drives some more and stops at another gas station. Yes, the team loves to stop at gas stations. I just have to assume that it's because Lloyd is old and has to pee a lot. But we'll leave that up to you. While they're at the gas station, Mike and Gary are talking, and they're talking about the alpha receiver specifically. Both of them are questioning the legitimacy of this alpha receiver. They list off all the different possible things of what they think the alpha receiver could actually be reading, whether it's body heat, magnetic interference, or just random chance. But then, by far, my favorite part in the entire film is when Lloyd comes out of this gas station, presumably from his bathroom break, and he's just holding about 6 different bottles of wine. He's carrying it out like it's the most normal thing in the world, and just listen to what he has to say.
He said, "I got some wine over there," and I went over there and I found it, and then it was all
Red Mesa,
and they were all dirty, dusty bottles and everything. He said, "I'm gonna let you have all of those for $1 a piece if you'll buy them all."
what a bargain.
And I says, "I'll buy them all."
It's the funniest part in the early movie, and I personally think that it's so well timed. Tensions rising, the mysteries deepening, and then all of a sudden, Lloyd's walking out with a bunch of wine. It's just perfect. After Lloyd's little wine incident, the crew then drives on some more, and Lloyd sits in the back seat and starts to shout conspiracy jargon and about how the government is brainwashing everybody. He's rambling on, but eventually the team gets closer to where the Wicksboro site is supposedly located. They're turned down a long, flat road, just desert kind of stretching forever. Lloyd is confident at first, even excited. He exclaims, "The house should be right off this road. We lived in a big place. You can't miss it." But as they drive, there's nothing. Just dust and heat and miles of nothing. But Lloyd continues to explain that the town should be there. It should be right here. And in that moment, you can kind of feel Lloyd shift. Before this, Lloyd was eccentric, doomsday-ish, but still believable as a harmless theorist. Now, you kind of start to see Lloyd as delusional. They drive further down the road until it collapses into broken dirt and just ends completely. The town is simply gone. They walk down on foot. Mike and Gary are skeptical, and then Lloyd stops abruptly and gestures that they're supposedly standing in the town square, but the camera only shows barren desert. This isn't the town was evacuated kind of disappearance. This is a wiped off the face of the planet kind of disappearance. And the brothers realize that either Lloyd is truly delusional or something catastrophic really happened here. After the driving ends, we cut back to Mike and Gary resting in the hotel room. Exhausted and discouraged, Gary asks what do you think about this guy? And Mike's answer is honest. He says,
I think he's a crazy old drunk.
I agree.
and I mean, this is real. Who wouldn't really think that Lloyd is kind of crazy and delusional at this point? And this is why the movie works. It never really commits to the theory, it lets characters be human. Mike sits on the bed, defeated. He says, I just want to go home, that this isn't going the way that he planned, and that he just wants to go home and see his wife and kids. In this moment, the two seem genuinely done with the documentary that they were trying to film. But then here comes Lloyd with absolute conviction. He insists the government had to clear out the existence of the town. They had to cover up all the deaths. They had to have just bulldozed it flat. He then becomes hopeful again and says that he remembers his bunker, his old laboratory that him and his colleagues used to work in. And at this point, he claims that he can find it with a homemade dowsing rod. And for anyone that doesn't know, a dowsing rod looks something like this. It's used to basically find things underground, such as water, caves, minerals, or I think some people have even said dead bodies, but I could be completely wrong on that. Mike and Gary then exchange the look of, we're dealing with a crazy person. But in the end, they do agree. The team then walks back out into the desert at 2:30 in the morning, equipped with flashlights and shovels, and Lloyd's homemade dowsing rod. Gary gets annoyed eventually, Mike gets irritated, and Lloyd is just being stubborn. But in this point is the only kind of real jump scare that comes throughout the whole movie. The guys are just walking down a dirt path, and I truly don't think that this was scripted. I think it was just something that happened. But either one of them steps on a snake or something, and they just start yelling and screaming, and it goes from like really quiet to really loud, and it's honestly really fun.
What the fuck? What the fuck? Oh, shit!
They search him more, and Lloyd claims that he's found his bunker with the dowsing rod. They start to dig, and minutes pass. Mike gets irritated, Gary's getting irritated, but Lloyd is just insisting that it's there and they should keep going. Then they hear a loud metal thunk as their shovels hit the door of the bunker. As they're clearing the dirt, they reveal a large steel heavy door. They open the door and see a rusty metal staircase leading into a pitch black dark room. They argue a little bit on who should go down there. Then Mike and Lloyd go down and enter into the bunker. The staircase is steep. The bunker is dark and claustrophobic. There's old tables, papers thrown everywhere, broken glass. And then, incredibly, they find it. The original Alpha receiver prototype, just left behind like a relic. Lloyd is overwhelmed. This is decades of fear and trauma just manifesting right in front of him. He goes to whisper that this is proof, but before Mike and Lloyd can celebrate, Gary's voice cuts through the bunker.
Guys, get up here quick! I just saw a car fall out.
They then rush out of the bunker to go and confront whoever just pulled up. Turns out, it's a police officer that's examining their car. Mike improvises and says that they're just filming a documentary for the desert wildlife. But the cop isn't impressed. He takes everyone's IDs and tells them to sit tight as he goes back to his car. As the officer is at his patrol car, Lloyd is whispering, saying that they need to go back and grab the Alpha receiver prototype. But before they get too deep into conversation, the cop returns and exclaims that they're trespassing on private property, and if they're ever caught out there again, that they're going to be going to jail. At this point, I think Mike and Gary start to realize that this is no longer Lloyd's weird delusional story. They just got caught in a restricted area by someone who knew far more than what they were telling them. They regroup back into the hotel to figure out what they should do next. Gary says that they already have video evidence, but Mike and Lloyd think that they need to go back to the bunker and retrieve the Alpha receiver for physical proof. Reluctantly, Gary agrees, and they decide that they'll all go back out the next morning right at dawn. This then leads us directly to the early morning of November 3rd. The desert is quiet, the air is cold, and all three men are back on their way to the bunker site. When they go back, they decide to approach the bunker site from a different angle to try and avoid being caught. As Lloyd kind of leads the way, Mike and Gary are a little bit behind them, and they start to ask themselves some more questions. Gary asks if he was right about the bunker, could he be right about everything else? Mike pauses. He's been kind of skeptical for most of the film, but even at this point he says, I'm not sure. It's subtle, but you can kind of feel the shift. The documentary is no longer humoring Lloyd. They're starting to believe him. But just as the three are about to reach the bunker site again, Mike quickly tells everyone to get down and duck behind some brush. Mike says this because as they're approaching, he sees a group of men around the hole that they just dug the night prior. Gary zooms in his camera, and what he sees is the same police officer from the night before. Along with this police officer, there's a couple men that are all dressed in black suits. These men being presumably the BEI, or the Bureau of Extraterrestrial Investigations. The men are methodical and professional and not confused. They're expecting to find something. Mike, Gary, and Lloyd then proceed to run back to their car, and in my opinion, this is the only time that I think the acting needed a little work, but it doesn't ruin anything. They then hightail it down an empty road where Lloyd explains that all of those guys that they just saw were aliens or feds. At this point in the story, everyone starts to get really paranoid and freaked out, and Lloyd is saying, don't use your cell phone, they're gonna track you, and just telling everyone that they need to get the heck out of Dodge. Lloyd starts bringing up the idea of fleeing to Mexico while Mike just wants to go back to LA to his wife and kid. They continue to argue some more about where they should flee to and eventually decide on El Paso because Lloyd convinces them with this perfect line.
Why El Paso? We can get fucking lost in El Paso!
After deciding where they want to flee to, the crew drives along some more. While driving, they come across a white car that looks similar to the one that they're currently driving. However, this car is stopped on the side of the road and all of the doors are open. As the crew gets closer, they notice that the back windshield has been blown out and there's a blood splatter on the front windshield. They also realize that there's blood streaming from the passenger seat all the way down onto the street. To me, this implies that the BEI or the aliens thought that this car was our main characters and attempted to take them out. However, it was just an innocent bystander that got caught in the crossfire. Seeing this, the crew kind of panics and decides to go and trade in Mike's car. They're trying to break any form of tracking that the BEI or aliens may have on them. Once they've traded in Mike's car, they leave and they point the alpha receiver to the lady that just sold them the car, and apparently she's an alien. Whether you believe it or not, it doesn't really matter. What matters most at this point is that now Gary and Mike believe it. Because every time that the device has been used in the movie so far, it's been consistent, and every time it lights up alien, something bad has happened. We move on to the crew taking a breather on the side of the road. Mike tries to call his wife again, however, he doesn't get any answer. Gary then decides to call his dad since he's in a different time zone and should be able to answer the phone at the moment. However, he doesn't answer either. Both families are not picking up and not responding. Mike and Gary then explain to each other that they're both pretty scared and they don't want to die, and at this point they truly do believe Lloyd. That night they're driving away and they see a police car stopped on the side of the road. This police car is stopping traffic and checking inside of the vehicles with a flashlight. Lloyd whips out his alpha receiver and points it at this cop. It doesn't light up human, it lights up alien. The team quickly turns around and decides to head in the opposite direction. They're no longer in paranoia, they're kind of in survival mode. As they drive some more, the crew eventually finds another motel that they can rest and stop at. Here at this motel, they realize that they need outside help. They need someone that's on their side that's going to help them get out of the situation. And for some reason, the first person that they think of is calling a news station. But I guess it just kind of shows how desperate they are. They find a journalist named Martinez who agrees to help them and try and get them out. Martinez and the crew discuss some details, and eventually they decide to go and meet at a city called Horizon City. After confirming their plan with Martinez, the group decides to get some food at a local restaurant and figure out their route to Horizon City. Lloyd does what he does and checks the restaurant before entering to make sure that there's no aliens, and they're all good. At dinner, Mike and Gary both try to call their families again, however, they're met with silence. After wrapping up dinner at the restaurant, the crew decides to go back to their motel. However, before getting too close, Mike tells everyone to stop. He thinks they see something inside of their room. Gary zooms in the camera, and all we see is a flashlight sweeping across the window. Someone is inside of their room. Lloyd turns on his receiver, scans the room. Alien. The guys then sprint back to their new car and escape into the night. As they keep driving, they pull off to the side of the road, and at this point they notice that another car has been following them because they also pull off to the side of the road. Lloyd again pulls out his receiver, points it at the car, and it's an alien. Mike makes a quick U-turn in attempt to catch the chase car off guard. However, during this U-turn, Mike gets stuck in the sandy shoulder of the road, and then all three of the guys decide to hop out of the car and just start pushing it, which, I mean, just had to have been the craziest sight from the chase car. Just watching all three of them just pop out and start pushing in the middle of a chase. But okay, anyway. Eventually, they get the car out of the sand and continue on down the road. As they're speeding along, tail car closely following behind them, Mike decides to turn off onto a smaller dirt road. He turns off onto this dirt road, but the chase car is getting closer and closer to the point where they're almost bumper to bumper. However, the chase car suddenly stops as if it almost hits something. As the chase car's headlights continue to fade out of view, Mike just keeps on accelerating. At this point, they've lost the chase car, but Mike continues to accelerate down the dirt road. Barely visible, Gary continues to ask Mike to stop. Again and again, Gary asks Mike to stop accelerating, and then we are met with tires skidding, metal clashing, glass shattering, the car rolling, and a crash. When the camera turns back on, Gary and Lloyd are crawling out of the wreckage, but you can't really see them. However, Mike is nowhere to be found or heard. Then, all of a sudden, the headlights from the chase car they just lost reappear. The car goes to investigate the crash. Two men in black suits hop out of the vehicle. We hear Mike screaming in agony, and then silence. Mike is dead. We move into the next day as Gary and Lloyd are continuing to walk throughout the desert. No food, no water, just fear, and the tapes that Gary has managed to hang on to throughout this entire time. At this point, Lloyd is apologizing for everything. He feels like he's to blame for the entire situation, just how he feels with his sister. Gary tries to reassure Lloyd, but Lloyd just isn't really keeping it together. Unfortunately, this will be one of the last moments that the two share. As Lloyd and Gary continue to walk throughout the desert, they hear a faint whiz, almost too quiet to notice. Gary tells Lloyd to get down and hide behind some brush. Gary zooms in with his camera to see if he can spot the threat. However, nothing is easily visible. As Gary is circling around searching for the threat, he pans back over to Lloyd as Lloyd pokes his head out slightly. And then, Lloyd takes a bullet straight to the forehead and collapses instantly. Gary screams a raw, panicked scream and decides to take off. He abandons everything except his camera and tapes. And from here, the movie becomes Gary's nightmare. Gary goes and continues to hide. He covers himself with brush and twigs and tumbleweed to try and avoid any detection from helicopters. Miraculously, he manages to escape and makes his way to Horizon City. He's surrounded by helicopters with spotlights and men in suits patrolling the streets. Eventually, Gary finds a dark warehouse that he decides to hide in. However, a BEI agent is hot on his trail. We see this agent enter the room with only a flashlight. The agent then flicks on the lights to expose Gary. However, the agent doesn't necessarily see him at that time as Gary's hiding behind some file cabinets and stuff. The agent turns his back and Gary decides to make a run for it. Gary eventually finds himself in a dumpster, recording himself with only a big lighter as a source of light. While hiding in this dumpster, Gary says that he's contacted Robert Patton, the guy that they interviewed earlier, to see if he can help him out of this situation. Sadly, this will be Gary's fatal mistake, as he's never seen alive again after his little dumpster diary. The film then ends with 3 newspaper clippings. There are obituaries, cover-up obituaries. The first one is Lloyd's. However, it shows him under his alias, Joseph W. Newman. It also lists here that Lloyd died of a heart failure. However, we obviously just saw him get shot. We then cut to Mike's obituary, which does show some truth that he died in a car accident. However, it explains that his body was burned without recognition, along with his wife and kid. And lastly, we have Gary that shows that he just died suddenly. Not many further details. Everyone involved with Wicksboro had just been erased. So the film ends with these 3 obituaries. 3 normal sounding little columns in a newspaper. Nothing explosive, nothing sensational, apart from dying suddenly. And that, apart from all the aliens and conspiracies, is what makes the Wicksboro incident so unsettling. It ends the way a real cover-up would. Quietly, politely, boring on the surface, but horrifying underneath. There's no dramatic rescue, no heroic reveal, just the slow erasure of 3 people that tried to expose something. And it mirrors exactly what Lloyd has been saying this entire film. Everyone connected to Wicksboro was done away with. By the time that the credits roll, you realize that this documentary that you've been watching is the evidence that Gary was going to hand off to Robert Patton. However, the implication is that Robert Patton and Gary never made this handoff. For me, there's 3 reasons why I think that this film just really works, and why people that stumble across it ask, wait, is this real? 1, the acting is aggressively normal. People talk like real people, they ramble, they crack jokes, they interrupt each other, they get irritated, they panic in a very un-Hollywood way, if you could say. And again, I think Lloyd is such an amazing character. He's got depth, he's got volume, he's crazy sometimes, he's drunk, but...
And I says, I'll buy them all.
Exactly. It feels more like listening to an uncle at Thanksgiving rather than a scripted character. The second reason being, I think that the film is rough in all of the right ways. Not bad, intentional, but rough. Handheld shots, static cameras, grainy footage, bad audio. It feels like something that you would find on an old burned DVD at the flea market. Lastly, the story escalates the same way that real conspiracies kind of escalate. Slowly, quietly, and then all at once. It starts with interviews, harmless weirdness, then missing records, then a town that's been wiped off the map, then a bunker, then FBI agents, then tailing cars, then Mike dies, then Lloyd dies, and then Gary dies. It's not crazy alien horror, it's bureaucratic violence. The kind that's frightening because it feels possible. The movie never asks, what if aliens? The movie kind of asks, what if someone knew something far more than what they were supposed to? It implies, if you know too much, then you're next. The Wicksboro film isn't one that simply asks you to believe it. It just asks you to watch what happens to anyone that gets too close to a secret. It's not the aliens that make it scary, it's the silence afterwards. Thank you guys so much for watching this first installment of Hayward Hermes. I'm gonna have a couple more things down the line. I've got like 10 different videos that I want to post. So if you want to stick around and see that, by all means, I'll be doing that. But yeah, I don't really know how to end these things. So bye.